Welcome to Massey College. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's a real pleasure to have you here for this another edition of the Massey Dialogues. Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. So today is a fabulous day because we're going to talk about something so dramatically important. And I really want to thank Professor and Senior Fellow Janice Stein for leading us in this discussion. So welcome again and continue to listen to Massey Dialogue and send us ideas about future dialogues. Janice.
Nathalie, and welcome to everybody to this Massey Dialogue on cybersecurity. Let me start by introducing our guests today. And let me start with Divas Kapur. This panel is Divas's idea. So thank you so much, Divas, for bringing us all together. Divas is a graduate student in our Department of Computer Science here at the University of Toronto and a resident junior fellow at Massey College, which means he has the privilege of living at Massey College. He has his BS in computer engineering from the University of Texas at Dallas, and he has worked as a cybersecurity analyst both at MasterCard and at BlackBerry. So thank you, Divas, for the hard work that you put in to organize this. Wesley Wark, I don't think needs any introduction to anybody in Canada and beyond who works in the field of international security and intelligence. Wesley, when I describe you, I say you are the leading world expert on intelligence. You are a historian of intelligence. You are a student of contemporary intelligence. You provide policy advice to government after government. I could read this extraordinarily long biography. Let me just tell our audience that we have, I think, the very best in the world with us. And I'm so delighted, Wesley, that you made time to join us. So welcome.
Janice, the great thing about platforms or this platform is you can't see me blushing, but thank you for that.
Oh, no, and I meant every word, let me assure everybody. Our third panelist today is David Lee, again, a colleague at the University of Toronto. He is a University of Toronto graduate and went on to do his doctoral work at Stanford and is currently a professor in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering here at U of T and a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Secure and Reliable Systems. David is a really valued colleague. He reaches out beyond his department, partners with our Citizen Lab here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and it's also leads a team at the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, and is a senior fellow at Massey College. So just great to have you with us, David. Let me start our conversation and we will go all over the place. But Wesley, put the challenges we face in cybersecurity today in historical context. When you and I were chatting, you said to me, Janice, the best defense is defense. I know what you mean, but elaborate on all of that, and then we'll go to Divas and David.
Janice, thank you for that sort of lead in. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that probably the historical context isn't very helpful to us in this current moment. We've really never experienced the kind of universal threat that the potential for cyber violence or cyber aggression or even in an extreme cyber war presents. We've just not seen anything like this in the past. The the threat is unique. I would say it's often described by professionals in the technology space, in particular, as in terms of what they call an attack surface, which is an easy enough phrase, I suppose, in general to understand. But when that phrase is used in conjunction with cybersecurity, generally you'll hear people say, well, the attack surface is very large and is growing, which simply means that there are so many vulnerabilities to cyber attack in various forms that the challenge that is presented by the idea of defense is enormous. And this I was very struck the idea of, in terms of cybersecurity, the best response or the best defense is defense. This is actually, I'm borrowing a quote from Shelley Bruce, who's the current chief of our communications security establishment, the federal agency responsible for cybersecurity and cyber intelligence globally. And it was an interesting reflection that we can, I hope, unpack a bit. She didn't really enlarge on it. But I think she was really trying to call attention to the fact that there's been a lot of concern about cyber offense, which we should come to, but cyber defense is where you begin. Just very, very briefly, in terms of the scale of the challenge in trying to secure our cyber world, which we're very, very, engaged in Canada. Canada is one of the leading countries around the world in terms of the ways in which Canadians live digital lives. The statistics are really quite extraordinary. And the challenge really operates across, I would say, 4 dimensions. So, and I'll just enumerate these, and then I hope we can have a bit of a conversation about some of them. The first dimension is just personal cybersecurity, and that is obviously a challenge that we can come to. The second dimension is private sector cybersecurity, which in essence we're talking about the business community and its capacity to protect its own data, which is often our data, from illicit use by people who might work their way into those systems. And the private sector challenge really is distinguished, I think, in terms of the scale of the private sector company we're talking about. The larger enterprises, something like a national bank, for example, those enterprises have very, very strong cybersecurity capabilities. But the minute you move down into the smaller and medium enterprises, you begin to see all kinds of vulnerabilities, because those enterprises often don't have the capacity and sometimes don't have the will either to build strong cybersecurity defenses into their systems. So they offer part of that large attack surface that folk often talk about. Then there's the government space, and whether it's federal or provincial or municipal, there are different levels of cybersecurity that are applied across those jurisdictions. I would say that at the federal level, we have, in Canada at least, a pretty strong and well-recognized capacity to defend the federal government's information infrastructure, and that's the job of the Communications Security Establishment, which I think has a very high reputation among its intelligence partners in what's called the Five Eyes intelligence network, which links us to the United States, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. So at least in that one sector, protecting federal government information infrastructure, we're probably not badly off. But then we move to the international. This is the fourth dimension, the international realm of cybersecurity. And there, the challenge that we face is in trying to come up with international norms, perhaps international regulations, even trying to imagine international laws that would set down some standards for agreed cyber behavior in the international kind of digital information space. And there's been a lot of work put into that at the United Nations and other multilateral fora, but we haven't made a lot of progress. And we haven't made a lot of progress, and I'll just end on this point, and it's a rather pessimistic point, because we are seeing a process, and I'm sure this is something that Janice in particular could reflect on for us all. We're seeing a process in which the international community is increasingly fractured and finding it difficult to comport itself according to any, what is often called rules-based international order. And the fracture in particular distinguishes between what I call authoritarian nationalist regimes, of which the two leading candidates or greatest powers in that camp are Russia and China, and democracies, which obviously Canada is in that camp. And then there are hybrids and democracies that are declining, and all kinds of gray areas between authoritarian nationalist regimes and democratic regimes. But the fracture between authoritarian nationalist regimes and democracies is very marked in terms of how they think about the digital space, how they think about cyber tools and cyber security. And I think it's going to be very difficult to come up with international norms and standards. But at the same time, ultimately, no individual nation or country like Canada can secure itself. So we both need that international system to work well, but we're a long way from seeing it working well, and the immediate future doesn't look very promising. So let me end on that slightly pessimistic note.
I agree with Wesley that we've put so much effort into international norms. We're not close, frankly, to any agreement, far away from rules, and yet it's very similar to a global pandemic. You cannot secure yourself on a national basis. And I think that's something that we'll come back to. Wesley, I'm going to go now to Divas, who has worked in the private sector. And if I'm not wrong, Divas, you are interested in risk management.
Yes.
Right. And risk management is something that we think about in international politics. We think about it nationally. We think about it locally. And it says there is no absolute security. How do we manage the risks? So when you hear Wesley talk about the multiple risks at multiple levels, how do you think both leaders in the private sector and the public sector should think about risk?
Thank you, Professor Stein, for the question. And you're absolutely right when you say there is never going to be something which is zero risk. And the analogy I'd like to give out is when I compare security to a system of traffic. So, yes, you can ensure that there are never going to be accidents on the road. And the only way to do that is to never have any vehicles on the road. But that's not very useful, is it? We want to enjoy the benefits of technology that we have worked as sort of stepping into the digital age, like computers and the internet can do wonderful, useful things for us. So we definitely want to enjoy those benefits. But we need to put security measures in place. So, like with risk management from a private sector, uh, earlier days of the internet, it used to be essentially gentleman's agreement. It was like smaller in scale and a system of honor and trust. But now, as the size and scope of not just the network size but complexity, Professor Wark was talking about attack surface and such. As we move to a more and more digital world, we have to recognize that that does sort of put more of our assets and information out there. So we need to secure them properly. So whether it's concepts like defense in depth or zero trust, essentially the mindset has shifted from uh, sort of securing individual assets to being in a mindset of assumed breach. So like the private sector is handling that in that way, like just sort of taking out things like cyber insurance and informing users of sort of safer measures. And just cybersecurity is a constantly changing science because technology is ever changing. So just coming up with more secure methods to uh, help themselves and their users is something the private sector is taking in this approach. With the public sector, it's an interesting conversation because uh, a lot of times those who are in, for lack of a better term, power or the ability to effect public reform and changes in public policy are unfortunately not as aware of how uh, digital realm works or technology works. You keep hearing examples of this when, like, say, you look down the states and you have hearings in Senate with the they've been with the sort of big tech sort of depositions that they have, and you hear stories like the Missouri governor sort of censuring a journalist for exposing some vulnerabilities in like one of the Department of Education's records and such. So I really need to think that, similar to like intelligence briefings, I really need to think like that people in who hold public offices need some sort of basic sort of cybersecurity briefing or training and such. That way they are more informed on how to make better decisions and such. And I think it needs to be a partnership with private enterprise, because uh, like I remember sort of electing like our elected officials and such, but does anyone sort of remember electing Mark Zuckerberg or Tim Cook? uh, but they own most of the data in not a legal sense, but they are responsible for the security of most of the data that many of the sort of people my age use. So it has to be a partnership of, where's the buck stop, and how are people more secure online.
Thank you for that, Diva. So we're going to come back to that one too, because this, I think, is going to be one of the biggest public policy challenges we're going to face over this next year and next decade, really. David, you work right now at the intersection of all of this around the concept of secure systems. When you look out at the technology landscape, those of us who are non-technologists but worry about the consequences can see a rapid development of new technologies, which both can have both very positive effects and very negative effects on securing systems. How do you think about this? Whoops. I think you're on mute there, David. We can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, good.
Okay. So the way one of the biggest effects I've seen is that increasingly it used to be that if you bought some technology, like a device from a certain vendor, and you would rely on that vendor's assertions that, yes, we've tested the technology, we know it's secure, it's safe. It was almost part of just reliability testing. But recently, as we know, now it's become important who built that. Was it a company? Where was that company located? Do we trust the country or the places where that company is located? What do we think about how that company is run? And so increasingly, we're starting to base those things not on technical measures, but just on where it came from. Now, I think there's a couple of problems with that. One is that even if nothing is really made by one person or one company anymore, so even if the corporation that made it is, in Canada or the US or one of those places, they may outsource technology or rely on technology that's built all over the world. It's really a global market. The other thing is, so there was this incident with a company called SolarWinds, and SolarWinds is a homegrown, completely American company. Like the U.S. government, a lot of agencies in the U.S. government were using it, as well as big tech firms like Microsoft, and they were compromised, it seems like, by a foreign actor, and that foreign actor used an American company to basically get malware and spyware and all of those things into all sorts of systems. So I think this is going back to the point that the attack surface is really enormous. There's really no way you can kind of say, okay, these people are trusted, these people aren't, this is going to be trusted, this isn't. You really need a way of assessing every piece of technology on its merits rather than kind of where it came from or how it was created.
And that's really an enormous challenge, David, because every piece of technology is a technology of technologies. So you have to assess the components of the technology, and it becomes, frankly, a really demanding challenge. Let me push you just a little bit further on something that I heard you say before I go back to Wesley on the same point. There is a discussion in Ottawa with respect at probably the easiest level to think about this, which is the national level, because there's more control and more hierarchy and more top down, which makes it a little easier than at the individual or the private sector level or the international level. But there is a discussion in the law which continues, which distinguishes between core and periphery in protecting the attack surface. And as we move into a 5G world and then a 6G world, the sense is, well, we're really good. We protect the core. We don't have to worry about that. Now, that seems to me a really short-sighted view. And the core means less and less and less as we move out and connect more and more until we get to a point where everything's connected to everything. Are these outdated concepts when we think about security, David?
Yes, I think increasingly so. So I think there's two places where that concept could be used. I think in general, when we talk about core, we're talking about a place where there's a lot of traffic, a lot of data moving through it. And so traditionally, you could think of these as choke points. And if I control the choke point, like from a military sense, then I could secure what was inside the choke point, and I wouldn't have to do that much checking. Or I wouldn't have to protect that as carefully. If I basically secured the locks and the doors, I know whatever was inside would be safe. But the problem with technology is it's kind of pervasive, right? So almost everything is a door now, and so it's not easy to, it's not even possible, I think, to secure all the choke points. So the difference between core and periphery is really becoming porous, is a term that people use. There's really no one place you can choke things off anymore. Now, the other terminology where this is maybe more relevant is just in the 5G space. I know that there's been a discussion, do we want to allow the same vendors into the core of 5G as opposed to the edge or the periphery of 5G? And
And that's
that's a very,
around Huawei. For our viewers,
right.
we've had a vigorous discussion in this country whether we allow Huawei to build our 5G technology. And I think you were alluding to that earlier, David.
Right. So in that specific case, because of the architecture of 5G, there is a difference between core and edge. Now, I don't think it's well understood whether edge attacks, like someone who controls the edge could get into the core or might have as much influence. But because the 5G architecture places some very specific rules, and to use an analogy, those doors are a little bit better defined. We know where they are. That does raise the possibility that you could secure the core without securing everything in the edge. But I just wanted to say, in general, you can't apply that kind of approach anymore.
And I think even, and I'm coming to you, Wesley, now for how this translates into strategy, but I think as 5G develops and as more and more moves to the edge, and stuff on the edge connects to the edge, that's when that concept of core becomes less and less persuasive. So I actually want to challenge one thing you said, is that the federal government is in a good place to protect its core. I think it's correct as long as we're in the very early stages of 5G. I'm not at all persuaded, like David is, that we're going to be able to secure the choke points when more and more doesn't go through a choke point, but just connects on the edge. Which leads me to the bigger question. Do you have views on who should build our digital infrastructure for our government? And the digital infrastructure will be used not only by the government, but will spill out.
Oh, Janice, thank you for that. Listen, obviously, we should rely on those nice Nordic companies and countries to build our 5G. Nokia and Ericsson, and maybe we'll let Samsung into the space because it comes from a nice Asian country. And I say that, with obvious frivolity, because I just to reference back to David's point, even companies that operate their headquarters in countries that we trust as allies and have systems similar to ours and have, for example, civil rights and privacy legislation similar to that of Canada. Those companies are global enterprises and they're engaged in global supply chains. And so they are not just making a Swedish or a Norwegian or a Finnish network. They are building a global system on the basis of global components. And this has been I think one of the things that's bedeviled the 5G discussion because we've been convinced by arguments put forward primarily by others that a company like Huawei cannot be trusted as a provider of 5G, either core or periphery elements, because it is regarded as a champion company by the Chinese regime and could be subject to Chinese espionage laws and so on. And that's probably not a debate that we want to get into here, but suffice it to say that this is based on this concern about the untrustworthiness of Huawei is based on a suggestion of how its equipment, both hardware and software, could potentially be used by a regime, China, which increasingly we regard as adversarial in many respects. But what it overlooks, I think, is the fundamental question that was actually exposed in the British process of testing Huawei's gear, a testing process that's essentially run by their signals intelligence organization, which argued that over the many years that they tested Huawei gear, they'd never come up with any evidence that there was any kind of espionage element built into it, or that it would be easily used for espionage purposes by a foreign state, but rather the problem was software engineering, fundamentally, that they had, as a company, had grown to become this global behemoth so rapidly that they hadn't paid proper attention to software standards and engineering standards, and that was the subject of the vulnerability. So I take from that the point that it is, we can't just distinguish, as David suggests very rightly, we can't just distinguish secure systems and non-secure systems on the basis of where companies that make them are headquartered. And nor can we, I think, automatically assume that companies that have a connection with adversarial regimes are necessarily untrustworthy. It's much more complicated than that, but ultimately goes to engineering standards and supply chain scrutiny. To come back to one thing, Janice, on core and periphery, I think increasingly as we move into 5G fully, and we're not there by any means in terms of a kind of distributed low latency network of devices, zipping around information and instructions through a very distributed network. We're really some years away from that, certainly in Canada yet, but we're heading in that direction. There is, I think, still a distinction between core and periphery in existing, early stage 5G and 4G and 3G systems for sure. But I would also say that it's important to remember that, and this comes back to the point about, is the federal government capable of at least defending its digital space through its cybersecurity practices? There is a distinction between a federal government space that is protected, and particularly protected because it contains national security information that is important to Canada, and a civilian space for digital information. And in any future system of rollout that we're imagining, that federal government space is going to be built very differently in terms of its construction, its principles, its security safeguards than the civilian spaces. And so even though there may not be a core and a periphery in the future, rollout of 5G, 6G, and whatever's down the road, there will be, in the federal government space, I think, a distinct effort to build core and periphery to security standards, which will be very different from the civilian space, on the assumption, which may or may not be right, that the federal government digital space needs more protection than the civilian space. So
I
that's
think
always
that
been the assumption. I'm not sure it's a good assumption going forward.
But I think that's the right question. What needs extra protection? What kinds of data need extra protection? And that leads me, I'm going to take us down a little bit of a side path here, Wesley, David, and Divas. So bear with me while I do this. But we've had coming through a very interesting year. And to go back, and Wesley has written about this, to go back to the before times, before the pandemic started, We had an absolutely great intelligence network, the GPHIN, which was our Global Public Health Intelligence Network in Canada. It was run on a shoestring, but it was really good. It monitored and scraped data from all over the world from public websites and could warn of unusual activity when they would watch hospitals or traffic in a city or food trucks rolling up and stopping outside a city. And they were first class. That was shut down in myopic decision because they were too international. They weren't focused enough on Canadian material. And their scientists were also frustrated because data was not coming through the system. And we've gone back to the drawing boards now. We're going to stand it up again. We're going to reinvent the wheel. But the bigger question for me is how wide, and Wesley was an astute and early critic of what was going on and recommended, in fact, that the national security envelope is growing and that global public health data is a legitimate national security concern. And I don't think there's any Canadian who's lived through this last 20 months who wouldn't agree. If that's the case, then I think we're in a different world because global public health data is national public health data, is provincial public, is private sector stored in many cases and is our data, but yet it has huge national security implications. So once we start to broaden the space, how do we begin to think about privacy? I want to make a really provocative statement in the hope I'll get the three of you going. From work I did this past year, I can tell you that privacy killed. And I'm deliberately saying it in the most provocative way that I can. Privacy prevented timely sharing of data. It prevented platforms were fragmented, they were siloed, data could not move in a timely way. And one of the big guardrails again and again against getting data to where it needed to go to make much better decisions about a rapidly evolving national emergency, which was the pandemic, was privacy legislation. And it is strongest, obviously, on health data. Divas, how do we address, I'll go to Divas first, then to David, and then back to Wesley.
I'm taking a contrarian view of this. Like I do think privacy is important. I do agree that in an unprecedented pandemic like this, it would have made getting access to data and information a little more challenging. But I think the alternative could be, and I think will be way worse if, like, you were to waive privacy protections for sensitive data like healthcare information and financial information, just sort of go away, because then who makes that decision as to when it's okay to waive and when it's not okay to waive? So I think that sets a dangerous precedent if we sort of do have conversations like that. uh, and Professor Stein, what was the second sort of, where did you want this conversation to head on
It
to?
was really around, are there limits to privacy? In fact, we're having the other conversation in public now. How do we protect our data from avaricious companies who take our data without compensating us? And that is a very important conversation, but it's one half. Have we built privacy protections inappropriately into areas that are now core to national security? Is the
Well,
question.
it's it's like it can be argued both ways. I think like we like
Which way do
these
you argue, Divas?
I'm on the privacy side. I want strong privacy laws, and I want the consumers and the owners of the data to be empowered, because I think if we sort of come it from a like federal or like a public policy lens, then yes, it may seem attractive to sort of have either a back door to some of these strong encryption systems that some private companies use. Like we heard the case with Apple a couple of years ago where they refused to sort of unlock uh, phone and biometric data for investigation, and like with COVID, I'm certain that access to data was delayed. So I definitely understand that, but I think if you think of privacy as a sort of right and not a privilege, I think like it can be argued that people who put their data online when they use apps, or they sign up to a government service or an email list and such, they're they should have a right to privacy and security, because I know you sign a terms of service agreement and such, and essentially you waive away your rights in a manner of speaking, and it's honestly impossible to read all the terms of service because they're 20 pages long.
Yeah,
But I
nobody
do
does.
I do agree that like the privacy should be viewed as a right, and not something that uh, can be waived and like as in one convenience, because I think then it becomes a political ploy, or like Professor Wark was talking about, the lack of an international standard, then then that also sort of enters the conversation. So I'd like to argue that strong privacy should be afforded to all digital citizens.
David?
Yes, so this is a question that's near and dear to my heart. So, around March 2020, when this was all starting to explode, I was on a multidisciplinary a team to try and get some data to do some modeling and tracking. And so, I think my answer to this is that um, you don't need to throw privacy out. Um, you can have your cake and eat it. So you don't want to throw privacy. It's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So it's not that the privacy is the problem; it's the implementation of privacy, and particularly the policy and the laws governing how privacy is protected are very antiquated. Let me give you an example. Is that as Divas mentioned, when you give your data, you give consent to this privacy policy, and the privacy policy outlines what they can do with your data. And so if I'm sitting on a large data set and all of a sudden a pandemic comes along and I say, hey, I want to use this data to predict where the hotspots are going to be, something very useful, or how many masks do I need, or where should I deploy my vaccines first, I have to go back to every person in that data set and get their consent, because I didn't have their consent originally to use their data for fighting pandemics. And most people would probably be okay with it, but the laws and the regulations say I have to do that. And that's just a non-starter. It's going to take months or years to do that. So then you
So
don't get the data for it. What are
yeah,
your alternatives? You get an,
just
sorry, go
stop
ahead.
on that. Just stop on that, David, because such an important point. If you had done that, the pandemic would be over before were able to get consent from people to do what was absolutely critical work in order to drive the allocation of resources. So that's an example of the perverse implication of privacy, which led me to make that comment at the beginning of the question. How do we fix that now, based on what we've learned over the last
Right.
20
Well,
years?
I mean, I think you need to reform policy regulation. And that's the big question, is what should what should privacy regulation look like, in the 21st century? Because the regulations we have now are, they're from a time and age when, I if you ordered pizza, you had to give your name and address to the pizza company. So what could they do with that? Or, I go to U of T, I fill out an application form. What can U of T do with the application I filled out? It's not for like, I have a smartphone and I'm walking around, my smartphone is transmitting data about me. What can people who receive that data do with that data? It's just a huge mismatch between what the time and age that the policy regulations, the privacy regulations were written for, and what we have today. And so I think real effort has to go into dialogues of what that new regulation should look like, anticipating all these different scenarios where it might come in. It's not
Do you
easy,
think,
but I think it has to be done.
do you think we need a change in our research ethics in university? For example, one of the interesting things, because research ethics would constrain you from doing the kind of analysis that you would have been forced to go back and get consent. But the research ethics boards during the universities actually moved and tried to enable as much research as possible. Do we need to rethink some of our, talking about our own house, Do we need to rethink some of our own policies, David, in this field?
Well, I mean, I think the research ethics boards serve an important purpose and they should continue to exist. I think that the problem is the research ethics boards are constrained by the privacy regulations still
Yeah.
ultimately. So, the truth is research ethics boards do a lot more than just deal with privacy too. So I think they're part of the equation, but they're not the main issue. I think the main issue is just how the regulation is it's drafted and implemented. It's very unclear. It's unpredictable for enterprise for when you're doing research, whether something that you're doing in terms of privacy will ultimately meet the regulation or not. Like no one can really answer that question until you do it, and that's just like an unworkable system, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's very risky. It's very risky for the
It's
researcher
very risky.
because the researcher bears all the risk. So for me, this is one of the big takeaways from these last 20 months that coming out of this. We just have to fix this. Wesley.
So Janice, I'm going to take your provocative suggestion and run with it in a different direction. And part of what I'm about to say was informed by the experience I had as on an expert advisory group for the Office of the Auditor General when
Right.
the Federal Auditor General was putting together reports for Parliament on the government's pandemic preparedness, including reports on GFIN and other things. One of the issues that was very strongly debated in that context with experts and Auditor General officials was around the challenges of data sharing and why we were having these challenges, health data sharing. And so what I'm going to suggest to you, Janice, is that I don't think it was an issue that privacy killed in the pandemic. I think the blunter truth is that federal provincial relations killed.
Oh,
And
yeah.
what I mean by that is that, despite a long awareness of the problems, going back to SARS and pre-SARS days, and by SARS, I'm talking about the epidemic that hit Toronto in particular in 2003, there's been a long awareness of the problems of mismatch between different jurisdictions and the health data that they have and their ability to share it. And that problem, in all of those long years, despite awareness of it, was never solved. So we ended up at a time just as COVID-19 struck, where there were no existing hard and fast agreements between the federal government and provincial governments about the sharing of health data, as astounding as that might sound. But that was the reality. There were no existing agreements.
It's
There'd been long
astonishing.
discussion about them, but they didn't exist.
Isn't
And
it astonishing, Wesley? It's astonishing.
it's just mind blowing. And there were colleagues taking part in that expert advisory group who'd worked on this problem for decades, and they just said like I've seen this whole story before many times. Anyway, they not only did we not have a federal provincial agreement on health data sharing. And I think that agreement could easily have protected health data, protected the privacy of health data. I think there are clearly ways to do that. And you're talking about large data sets and anonymized information, which is really, really what you need. Not only that, but the other problem was because we hadn't come up with a federal provincial framework for health data sharing, we also didn't have any common standards for health data or for systems to manage it. So in the early days of the pandemic, the federal government, believe it or not, the Public Health Agency of Canada was getting health data from the provinces in electronic form that they had to translate into their own systems manually. I mean, it just is among the many absurdities of our lack of preparedness. That was one. And I just hope that, for all the talk of wanting to, make sure that we're better prepared for a future pandemic, we really finally tackle these issues. And it's going to take some hard work in terms of federal provincial relations. And I think one of the experiences of the pandemic is that our existing kind of laissez-faire system for federal provincial relations in a major health emergency just doesn't work. So if you've got a federal emergency act, you better be prepared to use it, and you better be prepared. The provinces better be prepared to agree to allow you to use it. Anyway, that's another subject. The other last thing I want to say is just about the Global Public Health Intelligence Network. I mean, Janice is absolutely right about, you know, the ways in which we hobbled it and sort of turned it off, which was, you know, a really remarkable misstep. But I think it's also important to understand that for future pandemics, it's going to be vital for Canada and you know, the global community to be able to have an early monitoring capacity for global disease outbreaks. And you know, the challenge there is multilateral cooperation and being able to penetrate efforts by some regimes that may want to cover up the reality of disease outbreaks for their own reasons. But in a way, fortunately, and some people would disagree with me on this, fortunately, privacy doesn't come into it at all. We don't regard, for example, the experience of individual Chinese citizens in Wuhan to be a privacy concern to us in Canada. Some people would like to have a universal privacy rights regime, but it doesn't really play in the health emergency space. So there are no impediments to being able to do a better job in terms of global monitoring of disease outbreaks. On the privacy front, you know, no major impediments. You'd still have to be careful about, you know, Canadian citizens' data being caught up in that kind of activity and so on. But there, you know, it is all dependent on will and technology and analytical capacity, and you know, none of those things were really in play for us when COVID struck. Which is a real shame, because as the independent panel that was constituted to look at GFIN remarked, well, they were able to identify early on from media scraping, as Janice calls it, that a disease of unusual pneumonia-like disease outbreak had occurred in Wuhan. They were absolutely incapable of doing anything with that information that was helpful to decision makers down the road, and you know, that was the real problem, I think, with GFIN in its constitution at the time.
Let me ask you one follow-up question, and I'll ask if you could make 2 recommendations. You know, David Naylor wrote an absolutely wonderful report after the first SARS epidemic. Really, yes, just so right on. Almost none of it was implemented. And so I said the next report is not another set of recommendations, but a hard look at why none of it was implemented. That's what we really need. If you could make 2 recommendations coming out of the last 20 months, what would they be? Because you've seen.
Oh, sorry, Janice, it's a great question. And of course, I'd have to say that, you know, the Naylor Commission did remarkable work in a short space of time. I mean, they were constituted very quickly at the time by the then Deputy Minister, Anne McClellan. They reported, as I recall, within 6 months, while SARS was still kind of burning in terms of embers
and one of the
Canada.
principal recommendations was better federal-provincial coordination. Right?
It was. I mean, but you know, some of the recommendations that they did made around, you know, changing the governance of public health in the federal government were acted on. So out of that we got a Public Health Agency of Canada, and we got a Chief Public Health Officer of Canada, and so on. So some things were taken up. But you're absolutely right. Perhaps the spirit of the report, apart from some of its mechanics, weren't properly implemented. So to come to your question, I'm just buying time for myself to think about this. You know, I think that I'm going to stretch it a bit by saying 3 things. I think the first thing that Canada needs to deal with future health emergencies that kind of arise globally is much better intelligence. And we're going to have to rethink the concept of what health security intelligence actually is, and it cannot simply be left to a single agency siloed in the federal government to come up with that answer. So it has to be an integrated effort, along with partners. And you know, Canada, and again, the GFIN model is an interesting one. Canada was a pioneer in terms of early health, global health intelligence. We're nowhere on the global map now in terms of what we're doing in that regard. The British have, you know, fundamentally reconstituted their system. The Germans have set up a joint effort with the WHO on epidemiological intelligence and early warning. The Americans are making vast changes in their machinery, and we're sort of sitting on our hands for reasons that I don't really understand. And the Public Health Agency of Canada responded to the Office of the Auditor General's recommendations by saying that, you know, they'll take them on and they'll do some work, and they might be able to manage it in 2 or 3 years' time in the future. You know, that doesn't suggest to me any sense of urgency. So we need a different understanding of health security intelligence and how to do it. We need a much better capacity to understand the threat. You know, it's one thing to collect the information, the data, the intelligence. But you have to put it into a picture, and really come up with an understanding of threat. And there, our system was frankly hopeless. And one of the things that was lost sight of post SARS was, it wasn't so much in the Naylor Commission, but in the Justice Campbell report on SARS. You know, one of his great recommendations, Justice Campbell's great recommendations, this was an Ontario judicial inquiry into SARS, is to say, in future, we have to use the precautionary principle, which means that we look hard at a threat, and we don't try and wait for all the scientific evidence to come in before we make up our minds about that threat. The British use a basis called reasonable worst case.
Right.
You know, and that's an embedded formulation in British intelligence and in health policy. We don't have anything like that, but we're going to have to come to it. The final thing I would say is that we have to fix federal-provincial relations on responding to health emergencies, and I think we have to get past all the niceties around federal, provincial jurisdictions and all the walls we put around them, and recognize that when there's a national emergency, there has to be a national response. And I think, and to come to the point, the third recommendation is we need a real emergency act. As much as that has poor, bad historical overtones. We don't need a War Measures Act, but we need a real Emergencies Act that can be implemented with provincial support in a time like COVID-19. So we don't have all of these differing responses to COVID-19 across provinces and territories, sometimes responses that were very, very harmful to the citizens of those provinces and territories.
Those are great ideas, Wesley, and they're really truly are an agenda for all of us to push really hard from the outside now, so that we don't see some of the, frankly, needless loss of life that we saw over the last 2 years. Divas, if you could make one recommendation, having lived through these last 20 months, what would it be?
Again, I will use Professor Wark's extension and ask you for two recommendations, one from a sort of policy perspective and one to any viewers who are watching. First, I think some basic cybersecurity education at some level at schools is not needed, but it will be greatly beneficial because we're not moving to an age that is less digital. Like, we're becoming more dependent on the internet and technology. So uh, I believe some modicum of education on the cybersecurity and how to stay safe online will be super helpful, because unfortunately we see that some of the inequalities that sort of are present in our offline world are unfortunately being sort of extended into the online world as well. So I think some sort of education will help, both from a public policy perspective and just preparing future citizens of the digital age as well. And to any viewers who are watching, one recommendation I'd like to give you is please use two-factor authentication and stronger passwords whenever possible. But yeah, that's it from my recommendation side.
Those are both also great suggestions, Divas. We all should be doing it, every single one of us. And David, if you could make one or two recommendations coming out of what we've just lived through, what would you change to improve the security of our systems?
Right. So, aside from, better tools and more research, which is, I guess, my neck of the woods, I would like to put something to the people in the policy community, which is, I think we need better standards. I think I really like Divas's point about standards about education, but I would like to push it further. I think also um, technologies that gather data or could be used to communicate with others, form attacks, there should be standard around these. Like, I look at all the smart home devices, and there's one coming out every week. I would like to see some standard on how secure are these devices, so that when I go and buy one, or I tell my parents to buy one or my friends to buy one, I know that it's not going to blow up and cause a big problem. I think the other thing is what I've mentioned before, is also a rethink of regulation around things like privacy and security, so that they are more updated and more flexible, yet also achieve their purposes better in today's day and age.
Those, you know,
Professionally, yeah, I mean, just so sorry to interrupt, but I really like the idea of, like, I call it a cyber nutritional label. Like, we have ingredients and sort of how much carbs and protein and sugar and such in grocery aisles. I really stand very strongly for a cyber nutrition label for any technologies or products we use. So just wanted to chime in with that.
well, these are great recommendations. I take them all to heart because I come out frankly infuriated by some of what I've seen over this last year, and I think we all have a capacity to push harder to get better public policy in these areas. David's last comment about standards, I think that cuts across all level, at the individual level, as you talked about, at the national level, where there's a capacity to regulate around standards. And as Wesley will tell you, probably the most important decisions about regulatory regimes are not any longer made in formal bodies. They're made in international standard setting bodies in the early days of the development of technology. So I want to thank all three of you for a great discussion. Just really a pleasure to be with all three of you. And I think a rich agenda that we can come back and revisit in 9 months or a year and see if we've been able to push hard enough on any of these frontiers to get things going. Because I think I would tell you, so what did I take away from all this? We can't leave it to government to get this done. There has to be pressure coming from outside, frankly. So thank you, Divas, for getting us all together. Thank you, Wesley. Great to see you, and David. And thank you, of course, to Massey for providing a great platform. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Janice.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.